It's important to understand consumers' desired product benefits, their evaluative criteria, and the way in which they choose between products with differing combinations of benefits. Choice is a complex process, and our simplifications, while useful in managing and predicting outcomes, are certainly not complete descriptions of the process. Despite the fact that the choice rules we describe, or I will subsequently describe, are not precise representations of consumer decisions, they do enhance our understanding of how consumers make decisions and provide guidance for marketing strategy. So here we can see a situation where a consumer might be trying to make a decision about a smartwatch. You can look at the different models of a smartwatch, and you can look at the different attributes of the smartwatch and compare them on their performance on these different attributes. So clearly, consumers are faced with decision-making contexts such as these. So given this context, what will the consumer choose? It depends on the decision-making rule that they use. Rational choice models sometimes assume that the goal is to maximize the accuracy of the decision. However, sometimes the goal may be to minimize the cognitive effort required for the decision. People who are using this rule will use simpler choice rules, contain fewer alternatives, and evaluate fewer attributes. Sometimes you may just want to avoid negative emotions, and sometimes you want to maximize the ease with which the decision can be justified. So we're going to walk through a few of these different decision rules right now. So first, let's start with compensatory rules. So there's two basic categories of cognitive-oriented decision-making models, compensatory and non-compensatory. So compensatory should actually look familiar because this is something that we discussed in the chapter about attitudes made under high effort. So a compensatory rule suggests that a consumer makes a choice based on the relevant attributes on the decision context at hand and computes a weighted or summed score for each brand or option. So for example, again, this formula should seem familiar. The overall rating of a particular brand is the sum of the weight of the importance attached to the criterion times the actual performance of the brand on that criterion, or the evaluation of the brand on criterion I. And then the N is the number of the evaluation criteria that are considered. So here we've got 5 different criteria. So if we're looking at this consumption context where we've got the a priori identified evaluation criteria, the different car brands, and then the importance scores, this is the weight, the beta coefficient, you would compute the overall attitude towards the individual options by multiplying the performance by the weight. So 5 times 4, 3 times 3, 5 times 2, 3 times 5, 1 times 1. And you can see that spelled out here. If a consumer is using a compensatory rule, then Toyota would be the best choice because the score is the highest. Now, it's called compensatory because a performance on a particular attribute can balance out another. So we see here that price, Mazda performs really well in terms of price, but it performs less well on the dimension of safety. So because it performs well on the dimension of price, that balances out its less good score on the dimension of safety. Now, the rest of these rules are called non-compensatory rules because a low score or an inadequate level of performance will kick it out of the consideration set. So for instance, let's say you're a consumer and for you, safety is non-negotiable. Even if the car does really well in terms of price and looks great, if the safety features are not above a certain criterion point, you might eliminate it from the consideration set rather. So other dimensions cannot compensate for the performance on safety, for instance. Okay, so we're going to walk through 4 non-compensatory decision rules: disjunctive, conjunctive, elimination by aspects, and lexicographic. And I do want to say that consumers frequently use more than one rule to make a single decision. The most common instance of this is using a relatively simple rule to reduce the number of alternatives considered, and then to apply a more complex rule to choose among the remaining options. An example would be eliminating from consideration all the cars that are low in safety, like I mentioned before, using the conjunctive decision rule, and then the choice from the remaining options might involve carefully trading off among features such as price, resale value, and fuel economy using a compensatory model. So first, let's start with the disjunctive rule. It establishes a minimum level of performance for each important attribute, often at a fairly high level. All brands that surpass the performance level for any key attribute are considered acceptable. Using this rule, you would say, I'll consider all or buy the first brand that performs really well on any attribute I consider to be important. When the disjunctive rule is used by a target market, it's critical to surpass the consumer's requirements on at least one of the key criteria. This should be stressed in advertising messages and on the product package. Since the first brand the consumer evaluates that exceeds one of the requirements is often purchased, again, extensive distribution and dominant shelf space are important as is understanding how consumers break ties if the first satisfactory option is not chosen. So looking at this particular example, we can see here the attributes that are the important ones. So price, fuel economy, and safety. Under this rule, Mazda, Toyota, and Hyundai meet the minimum for at least one important attribute and are acceptable. So then the consumer would move beyond this to select the final choice using another rule. Now, the conjunctive decision rule is the mirror image of the disjunctive rule. It establishes minimum required performance standards for each evaluative criterion and selects the first or all brands that surpass these minimum standards. In essence, you would say, I'll consider for the all, or I'll buy the first brand that are all right on the attributes that I think are important. So looking here, we can see Mazda, Toyota, Nissan, and Hyundai are eliminated because they do not meet the minimum standards. So therefore, according to this rule, the last one that remains is Honda. Because individuals have limited ability to process information, the conjunctive rule is frequently used to reduce the size of the information processing task to some manageable level. It first eliminates those alternatives that do not meet minimum standards. This is often done in the purchase of products like homes, computers, and bicycles, in the rental of apartments, or the selection of vacation options. A conjunctive rule is used to eliminate alternatives that are out of a consumer's price range, outside of the location preferred, or do not offer other desired features. Once alternatives not providing these features are eliminated, another decision rule may be used to make a brand choice among the alternatives that remain. The conjunctive decision rule is commonly used in many low involvement purchases as well. So right now we're talking about high involvement purchases typically, but also in low involvement purchases. There, the consumer evaluates a set of brands one at a time and selects the first brand that meets all the minimum requirements. If a conjunctive decision rule is used by a target market, it is critical to surpass the consumer's minimum requirement on each criteria. Since the first brand the consumer evaluates that does so is often purchased, extensive distribution and dominant shelf space, again, are important. It's also, again, necessary to understand how consumers break ties if the first satisfactory option is not chosen. Moving on to elimination by aspects. This requires consumers to rank the evaluative criteria in terms of their importance and to establish a cutoff point for each criterion. All brands are first considered on the most important criterion. Those that do not surpass the cutoff point are dropped from consideration. If more than one brand passes the cutoff point, the process is repeated on those brands for the second most important criterion. This continues until only one brand remains. Thus, the consumer's logic is, I want to buy the brand that has the high level of an important attribute that other brands do not have. So looking at this example here, we can see the minimally required cutoff level and as well as the rank order in terms of importance. So first, we've got price is the most important. Mazda passes, Honda passes, Toyota passes, and Nissan passes. Then we move on to the next criterion, fuel economy. Minimally required level is 4. Mazda does not pass, Honda and Toyota do pass, as does Nissan. Moving on to the next round, third most important criterion, minimally required level is a 4. We had Honda, which passes, Toyota, which passes, Nissan does not pass, and then fourth, minimally required level of 3, Honda and Toyota again pass, but it's at this last round with resale value that we select Honda. Okay, and then the lexicographic rule requires the consumers to rank or order the criteria in order of importance. Again, the consumer selects the brand that performs the best on the most important attribute. If 2 or more brands tie on this attribute, they are evaluated on the second most important attribute. This continues through the attributes until one brand outperforms the others. The consumer's thinking is something like this. I want to get the brand that does the best on the attribute of most importance to me. If there is a tie, I'll break it by choosing the one that does best on my second most important criterion. The lexicographic decision rule is very similar to the elimination by aspects rule, but the difference is that the lexicographic rule seeks maximum performance at each stage, while the elimination by aspects rule seeks satisfactory performance at each stage. So looking back up here, we've got our rank ordered criteria, starting with the most important criterion, price. Mazda is the winner. It performs the best unequivocally out of all the other options. So when the lexicographic rule is being used by a target market, the firm should first try to be superior to the competition on the most important attribute. And you've got to do some marketing research to figure out what that is to your target market. The competitive superiority should be emphasized in advertising. It is essential that the product at least equal the performance of all of the competitors on the most important criterion. Outstanding performance on lesser criteria will not matter if a competitor is superior on the most important attribute. If a competitive advantage is not possible on the most important feature, attention should be shifted to the second most important, assuming equal performance on the most important one. If it is not possible to meet or beat the competition on the key attribute, the firm must attempt to make the other attribute more important. So, in summary, looking back at the table above and the objective performance of these different brands, you can see how people will come to different selections depending on the decision rule they are using. Now, this assails a common assumption that if people are just, quote, given the information, they'll all make the right choice or the same choice. And you can see that that's not true. Depending on the way that people are thinking, they'll come to different options. Now, from a marketing perspective, we can't specify with precision which rules are used by consumers in which situations. However, research does clearly indicate that people do use these rules. Low involvement purchases generally involve relatively simple decision rules like conjunctive, disjunctive, elimination by aspects, or lexicographic, since consumers will attempt to minimize the mental cost of such decisions. High involvement decisions and purchases involving considerable perceived risk tend to increase evaluation efforts and often may involve not only more complex rules like the compensatory rule, but stages of decision making with different attributes being evaluated using different rules at each stage. Of course, individual, product, and situational characteristics also influence the type of decision rule used. A marketing manager must determine for the market segment under consideration which is the most likely rule or combination of rules, and then develop appropriate marketing strategy.